Hello, Third Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with another U.S. 2022 congressional election forecast. Now, I once again have to say, I had a bug. This time I can show you what I did. So this is the raw numbers here by region, and this is the forecast you actually get. And you can see here's some Python code. In this block of code, this is an adaptation I have done since the Quebec model, where I have adjusted things based off of some calculations. I'm not going to really tell you how these variables are calculated, that doesn't matter. What matters here is this is iterating over I, and these variables last week were j, so it didn't do anything. Whoops. So a correction thing I did wasn't correcting things. And to be clear, this block of code here partially corrects for the fact that some polls, like Trafalgar or don't have any demographic data, or you'll see polls like YouGov or Rasmussen or Morning Consult, they have different levels of demographic data. This accounts for that. I was iterating over a variable that didn't exist. Well, technically it exists, it was a j up here, but long story short, it causes the math to be completely wrong. How bad did this change things? Well, we can actually demonstrate here, actually. I will just show you the code live. This is pretty cool, right? Fun coding sessions with... Here we go. So this is what happened. And when you run this, it gets you a much closer number because it's not actually correcting for anything. Because there's a lot of polls, such as Trafalgar, which are favorable to the Republicans that don't have demographic data. So if you do not correct for that, you have a much less accurate picture because Trafalgar is one of the better pollsters. So naturally, you would want to make sure you are considering their data. And for other reasons in my model, having a really high popular vote number, but you don't actually correct underlying data causes dumb math things. I'm not going to get into that. It's math. So I fixed a bug. So this result is once again, not a clean track from last week. I apologize. Now, what has happened in the last... Because of this, what has changed? And polls have changed. So the first one I will note, let me actually just grab this here because this will be easier way to show it to you. If we go by national things here, we can see, oh, look at this. There's a whole host of polls in the last little bit that had the GOP leading. And because of recency bias, I'll just close this. It has caused a big surge for the GOP. Now, the question here, and I suspect this will be the case, but the question here is this anomalous or is this actually a trend? I will get into that in a bit, but that is the main thought right here. That said, let us go through what has changed. So, in the Northeast, so the Republicans are now pulling out a seat in Rhode Island and Connecticut. They've picked up a seat in New York. They've gained some ground, relatively speaking, in Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and Rhode Island in PV terms. They are now leading in Michigan, but they're still not... They didn't pick up any seats. They're closer in several of the Democrat seats, but they're not actually leading any of them. They've flipped a seat in Ohio. They flipped 2 seats in Illinois, which possibly might be erroneous, but the model's the model. Minnesota, they are now very barely leading. We're talking small razor edge here. It's just barely outside of what you might have noticed in the past. I've striped areas. This is just outside of the range of where I would stripe things, so that would be within margin, like too close to call, frankly, is what I do when I stripe them. This is just very slightly safer than too close to call. But no C pickups again. Going through the South, They've flipped 2 seats in Virginia and now safely leading in Virginia. They flipped a seat in Florida. They flipped a seat in Texas. They have flipped a seat in Colorado. They're now leading in Nevada. They, in this context, is the GOP. They've flipped 2 seats in I was about to say Colorado, but this is California. And they flipped a seat in Washington, and now they are, once again, possibly erroneously, safely leading in Oregon. This one I'm not particularly comfortable with, but I'm sticking with it, the model. I suspect because a lot of these states, I'm not actually sure if Oregon is one. If Oregon is one, I might retroactively add this in. But a lot of states don't have party affiliation data available, so I haven't added all of it to every state, though in hindsight, possibly I should, because some states do have party affiliation by electoral district or county available. So in some states, like Oregon, I suspect if you actually count for that, it would clamp down my model saying this is leaning Republican. I don't think Oregon is actually leaning Republican, but since the underlying demographic stuff says it should, my model's calling it that way. But, and this is really important, just because an area is rural and middle class and blue collar doesn't typically mean it's going to vote Republican in this context. An example, Vermont should, by all means, based off of what the current polling is saying, it should be a very red state. Or at least a relatively red state. But Vermont isn't. And one of the best ways you can count on Vermont, I don't actually have this, but I have other methods to fix Vermont specifically, is Vermont's party affiliation numbers are very different. There's much more Democrats in Vermont than there are Republicans. Why is Vermont a Democrat? I couldn't really tell you. I'm not from Vermont, and I do not have the time in my life to be familiar with every single state. But I can tell you is Vermont is much more Democrat than national trends say it should be. National trends say it should probably be closer to Wyoming politically, but it is very Democrat instead. It's closer to, say, like, Maryland. Or I guess in the way I have it colored in this map, it's closer to Rhode Island or Connecticut. And it demographically probably should be closer to Wyoming. Or at minimum, New Hampshire. But it's not. So there is some things here, and I think I might be handling Oregon a bit wrong, because I'm really skeptical of this. I know it looks like the Republicans are going to flip this governor there, but I don't think they're going to flip the governor there because Oregon is going to vote red, is trending Republican right now. I think they're going to vote for Republican governor because of vote splitting. Vote splitting is not really the right term, but I'm going to, a spoiler candidate, the independent is taking votes away. Though that said, I'm not sure actually where the independent's votes would go because I haven't looked too much into the polls there. But needless to say, I'm skeptical in Oregon. I'm also a touch skeptical in Colorado because the Senate race doesn't look at all competitive. I still haven't done exhaustive look into it, but looking at it, it doesn't look like the Senate race is anywhere close to what the congressional race is looking like in Colorado, so that might also be something on my back to consider. I will try to get some of these considerations in for next week, but I really only have so much time in my life, so you're gonna what you get. So I will call out things I am personally unsure on as the person who makes these forecasts and makes this model. But it's up to your thought. Because, well, as always, any model from myself or anyone else, you really should consider on its based off of what, like, don't necessarily take everything I say or anyone else says as sacrosanct. Look at what their methodology is, look at their track record, look at what their concerns are, and consider that. In other words, do your own research. That said, why does it look like the Republicans are surging right now? Because again, I just showed you there's a bunch of polls that they're gaining a bunch of ground. Like, they're heavily leading. Trafalgar, Harvard-Harris, Rasmussen all recently have like +6. That's quite significant. And I should note, yes, Trafalgar and Rasmussen tend to be more what people would consider pro-GOP pollsters, though they're also some of the better pollsters, so take some salt with that. But Harvard-Harris is, from all accounts that I have seen, considered more of a neutral one, and it's also showing the same lead, and the poll happened at the same time. Because all three of these polls happen at roughly the same time. Yes, there was the YouGov Economist poll, or Economist YouGov poll earlier, and a Morning Consult poll earlier this week that showed Democrats leading. Economist YouGov is useful for demographic data because their demographics look relatively fine, but their weighting is really weird, so their headline numbers I don't really put too much faith in. I do consider them because how I calculate polling error, but needless to say, I'm a little suspect in general on the Economist YouGov polls. YouGov itself is a decent company, but the newspaper that buys their polls has a tendency to weight them weirdly, especially Economist. Economist, not a big fan of. Morning Consult, I don't really know. Like, their methodology looks fine, so I don't really know why their results are so different. Possibly they suck. I don't know. Or possibly everyone else sucks. We'll see on November 8th. But there's no obvious reason, based on the methodology provided by Morning Consult, has such different numbers. So somebody's wrong. I don't know who. So I consider both. That said, there is reason to believe that there is reasons that there should be a surge for the GOP right now. Most notably, there's two. Well, more like three. So, the first one, gas prices are going back up again. Quite rapidly because OPEC is cutting production. And related to this, Joe Biden basically tried to blackmail Saudi Arabia into postponing the oil price cuts for like a month. And Saudi Arabia came out publicly and said Biden did this, and I think that blowback is also hurting the Democrats. Because especially among Republicans and independents, I think that is going to encourage them to go out to vote, or Republican-leaning independents, because it's effectively the same thing that the Democrats impeached Trump for over Ukraine. That Trump was going to withhold military aid unless Zelensky did things. Biden literally did that with Saudi Arabia. Oh, well, you can't have your cake and eat it too, Biden. Or Democrats, I suppose. So I think that is definitely hurt. That there is really hurting the Democrats. The 1-2 punch of gas prices are going up because OPEC's cutting. And then the follow-up punch that Biden and the Democrats basically just clowned themselves by doing the thing they literally impeached Trump over 2 years ago. Or 3 years ago. So, a bit of a joke there. And then you have, like, the third level punch coming out from this is the Biden administration has intentionally restricted North American gas exploration and gas production with canceling Keystone XL pipeline, canceling federal fracking leases, stuff like that. So that has reduced domestic supply. You can look at it. You can look at a graph of oil prices or oil exports from the U.S. and it drops pretty significantly once the Biden administration comes in. So gas prices and energy prices are skyrocketing. At the same time, because OPEC is cutting prices, and the U.S. production is being strangled by the administration. So the crisis, in a large part, the energy crisis here, is in a large part self-inflicted. And I don't think this is going to go through in the polls too much, but it is also exacerbating the European energy crisis because the more energy the US has to buy from international oil markets, the less is available for Europe to buy, which bids up prices. If the US was exporting oil, there'd be more available, which would lower prices and make Europe have lower energy costs. That likely isn't going to factor in on people's votes because people rarely vote for foreign policy things. But people do love voting for, you're making my life more expensive. And you know what? These policies are, in fact, making people's lives more expensive. So we really shouldn't be that surprised that it looks like there's a bunch of momentum coming in here. And then the other big factor here is, I don't know if these were the official CPI numbers, but the producer inflation index numbers, which is basically the inflation cost to produce things, went up a faster, or was higher than expected for September. I don't know if it actually went up month over month. I don't recall the exact numbers, but it was expected to be like 8.3 and it's like 8.5%, which is not a big deal in and of itself. But when the numbers are higher than expected, and it likely is going to follow true with CPI numbers when they're released, because I don't know if they've been released yet. I didn't think to look into that for this video. That is also going to destroy the confidence in the people who are in government. Who's in government? It's the Democrats. They control the House, they control the presidency, and they more or less control the Senate. Yes, I know it's 50-50, so there's some things you can filibuster. And there are some Democrats, like Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin, who are willing to break party line. But I would argue in an actual proper democracy, people should always be willing to break party line, but that's another question altogether. So it's not like they can just blank check pass anything, but they can pass big pieces of legislation. They pass the quote-unquote Inflation Reduction Act, which no economist that I'm aware of thinks will reduce inflation. Kind of a meme, that there. So, in general, pretty much everything economically that could be going wrong is going wrong, except employment doesn't seem to be falling yet. Because the other big economic thing going on right now, and this one is visible, I'm not sure how much it actually affects regular people, but it is very visible. And I would argue, I'll rephrase this, I'm not sure how much it affects regular people's vote choices. It does affect regular people quite significantly. Is the stock market just keeps posting losses. Like, every week it's like, 5% drop in the S&P 500. And it's like, oh, well, that's great. And numbers keep going, and it keeps getting worse. So that directly is going to affect a lot of things, namely people investing, just because they have money to invest with. Your retirement savings in things like 401ks, also directly affected by the stock market tanking, because most of those are invested in the stock market. And, well, it's generally not, it's a very visible thing. I don't know how much it actually affects people's voting choices, because it's not a direct impact. Like, if you are a regular guy and you work 40 hours a week, 9 to 5, you could say, I'm not sure how much right now you will notice the stock market dipping unless you are currently invested meaningfully into it. But you will know it's dropping because it's always big news when the stock market's dropping, because it does affect a lot of things. The stock market isn't really the perfect indicator of the health of the economy because of various reasons, but it is a very visible thing. It's a very easy, it's a single number that's very easy to quote. The stock market's up 5,000 points or down 5,000 points or whatever. It's those numbers, that's not what it is, but it's easy to quote that number. So you get it a lot, and people can see it, and they can see it falling. And most people, from my conversations, most people don't think it's good that the stock market drops. So that's another factor that I think is causing this storm, or causing this current surge. It's likely, frankly, that this will continue to election day, because the CPI numbers aren't going to be released before November 8th. They're the October ones. So there won't be that last minute surge of the economy's recovering. That's not going to happen. It's very unlikely we're going to see the stock market recover all the losses we've seen this fall. So that's not going to happen. If it does happen, that would be honestly more sus than anything, because there's no particular reason why it should recover all of its losses right now, with energy prices going up and inflation running rampant still. There's no reason why it should go up. And in fact, there's plenty of reason to think it should continue falling, because again, this likely won't happen until after November 8th, but it's likely that the Fed is going to raise interest rates again in November. At least I would expect it to happen. Are they going to raise it by another 3/4 points? I don't know. I don't even really know why you'd bother forecasting it. I suspect it will go up, though, because inflation's still way, way above target. And you don't want inflation to become endemic. That is worse for literally everybody. And also, I'm going to get into this probably sometime after the election. But generally speaking, the West's central bank interest rates were way too low anyways. And it was really bad for the economy. But I will explain more on that in the future. It's far too much for this video. I would completely off track everything here to explain why I think that. But there is reasons for this. So, pretty much, the economy is in a bad state. It's real bad. We're pretty much full on recession. The other possible thing, no, I think the next quarter GDP numbers won't be out before the election. Though if it was out, it likely would be negative again. So, again, everything is going wrong. And the thing is, too, when Trump left office in 2020, January 2021, the economy was starting to rebound. Yes, maybe you could argue it was always going to go this way, or it was trending this way, or the events were going to happen anyways. You could argue that, and I'm sympathetic to this. But in the eyes of voters, in the eyes of, grading administrations, the people who have the power are the ones who take the blame when things go bad. Maybe the things were still going to go bad if Trump was in power right now. That is a contrapositive that we can't really go dissect into, but it's possible. Though some things likely wouldn't. There likely would be energy price in the U.S. likely would be in a better state, which would likely cause less downward pressure on the economy, less inflation pressure, so lower interest rate hikes, so the stock market would have collapsed slower. That's what I suspect would happen, but I can't tell you for certain. The big issues being that the immense amount of money printed on worthless crap to finance worthless crap, largely, and the after effects of the lockdowns were always going to cause an economic hardship. But the Democrats don't get to walk away from that kind of issue and say, no, it happened before us. But they were in power. And that's a problem. Everybody, like all the most big economists were saying that there likely was going to be inflation and other economic problems because of this printing. So what do the Democrats do in office? They spend more money, which, generally speaking, should stoke inflation more. They don't increase oil exploration or relax on that. They actively restrict it. So oil is more restricted, so you're more reliant on foreign powers. Those are two big things that you can personally say the Democrats did in power that further worsened the economy's current position. I can't tell you quantifiably that if Trump was in office and the Republicans had a trifecta, that the inflation rate would be X percent lower or the gas price would be X dollars. So I can't tell you that. But I can tell you the difference in policies between the Republican trifecta and the Democrat trifecta likely caused more inflation, higher gas prices, and a more rapid decline in the stock market, though the stock market was likely always going to decline when the interest rates started going up. And the interest rates were always going to go up because inflation was always going to skyrocket, and the central bank was always going to raise interest rates. Those are a given. The question, which we can't ever answer because we can't do we can't test the contrapositive scenario. We'll never know what would have happened the other way, but what we can say is what the Democrats didn't help. At least this core problem. You could potentially argue what they did might have helped other things. Maybe. I won't really argue into other policy things or other considerations that might have helped or might not have helped. But the core issue for this election is the economy, and all the things they did worsened the current economic state. Like, if you're denying that, you probably should double check. You might be denying reality here. The only thing you could possibly say about all their spending packages and curtailing of domestic oil production is, at best, for the Democrats, it didn't help. So if you did things that at best didn't help, you're going to get a lot of blame for when things go bad. And again, a lot of economists think the spending packages stoked inflation more, and the curtailing of oil production in the U.S. obviously increased oil prices in the U.S. That's not even contested. You can't reasonably contest that. The U.S. produces less oil now than it did 2 years ago. Oil prices are higher as a result. Yes, because of the war in Ukraine and what OPEC is doing, oil prices likely would be higher than they were in 2019. I think when they hit $2 a barrel. $2 a liter. $2 a gallon on gas. Not $2 a barrel. $2 a barrel would be a crisis. Like, the world would be imploding. All the oil companies would be going bankrupt. $2 a gallon on gas. It likely would be higher than that. But it probably would be lower than, I believe, the $4.50 a gallon it is right now if the U.S. was producing more energy. That's pretty safe to say. And similarly, if the Keystone XL pipeline was allowed to be finished, it will be finished now, so more oil could be exported from Canada to the U.S., which would allow more oil production in Alberta, because most of the oil companies there aren't actually producing at capacity. There's no export market, because they literally can't move the product. And that would also further reduce the price of oil in the U.S., because a bunch of supply that exists, like a lot of production capacity that can exist, would be able to be exported now. So, where does this go from here? Well, if we go back to here, and sorry if you heard that, someone was calling me. we're now currently at about plus 6.4 for the Republicans nationally. And they're up about, they're picking up 30 seats right now. I don't think we're really going to see the Republicans break 250. Even if they trend higher and they start getting plus 8, plus 9, getting more than 250 will be very difficult because at this point, if we look at this map, a large portion of the seats that they're not currently winning are urban seats. The only places where there's rural seats they're not currently winning are a few in New York, maybe some in Massachusetts you could call rural, though I'm not sure if you should call them rural. Maybe if you in California you could call rural, and some in Minnesota. So maybe, let's say 10 seats. The suburbs in all the urban areas that the Democrats are controlling are almost certainly not going to flip, so that's out of contention. And there's might be 30 to 50 suburban seats. I don't know the exact numbers here, but let's say 50. So let's say there's 60 seats that is the maximum possible areas the Republicans could win without the Democrats ceasing to exist. Right? Because urban New York City, urban New Jersey, urban Massachusetts, Chicago, LA, San Francisco area, those almost will never vote Republican in the current circumstances. Maybe 50, 100 years down the line, maybe. But right now, since the Democrats are leading, we'll just bring this over here because I'm failing really hard. If we bear with me. This would have been clever if I had it set up faster, but I didn't. Okay, here we go. The Democrats are leading by 22 points in urban areas across the U.S. And as you go further from, like, the Midwest and the South, that number increases. The Democrat lead in places like Atlanta or Houston or Charlotte is smaller than New York City or LA. It's still substantial. It's just smaller, if that makes sense. Like, it's almost insurmountable. But it's less insurmountable than places like New York, where it's like plus 90 Democrat. So, there's maybe 60 ridings that are even conceivable. And of those 60 ridings that are even conceivable, I would say winning even 10 of them would be remarkable. Like, that would be outstanding. It's very rare in the history of the U.S. that anybody gets, well, since the U.S. has had 435 Congress seats, that any party has gotten much more than 250. It occasionally happens. It does. There's been I can't think of them off the top of my head, but there have been cases of a more than 250. It's just really rare because, again, in the current climate right here, right? Massachusetts. Yes, Boston's like plus 80 or something, but like over here, the Congress district where the cursor is currently hovering, I can't think of the name of it. Well, it's a number, I suppose, but I don't know which number it was. That Congress district is still like D plus 15. So that's almost unthinkable. And it might not be this particular one I'm pointing at, but the closest district in Massachusetts is something like D plus 15 or something. Like, it's almost unthinkable. The 11th Democrat seat in Illinois is similarly, it's like D plus like 10 10, I want to say, maybe D plus 8. Like, it's really substantial lead considering the Republicans are leading by plus 6 nationally. The Democrats in the U.S., generally speaking, have a really overly concentrated vote. You see this heavily in presidential races where the Democrats blow out a couple states really heavily and the Republicans narrowly win many states. For example, in 2020, the difference between Trump winning and losing was like 60,000 votes in 5 states, something like that. I think Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin was the difference. And that was like, I think, 40,000 votes. So it is... The Republican vote is wildly more efficient, and the Democrat vote is wildly concentrated. So the Republicans are getting much more above 250s really hard. I really, like... I cannot stress upon you how unlikely that is. Like, right now they're leading plus 6. I think that Republicans would have to be leading, like, plus 10, probably, to get above 250. I don't have the exact numbers, and obviously more polls, demographic numbers will change, and if demographic numbers change, that will change the math. But with the current demographic numbers and the current lead, it would be really hard to do much better than 250. I would say anywhere between 240 and 250 seems plausible because some of these seats that the Republicans are currently winning are pretty narrow wins. But above 250 is almost unthinkable. And even if things get worse, like it'd be very... You're getting close to, like... I don't want to categorically say this, but I suspect you're more likely to see Republicans win 300 than like 260. Because the national environment that would require the Republicans to win 260 seats is almost the same that would require that would allow the Republicans to win 300. Because again, a lot of states, places like Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, the Democrats aren't blowing out some of these places, per se. Like, yes, plus 15 is the closest one in Massachusetts, but the Democrats are leading Massachusetts plus 40, right? So, in places like Massachusetts, it's very smooth across all the districts. Maybe plus 15 was wrong. Anyways, regardless. It's very smooth in Massachusetts. So, to get seats flipped in Massachusetts for the Republicans, they are very, like, by the point they start flipping seats in Massachusetts, they're likely going to flip like 6 or 7 at once. And it would only be Boston that would be left. But to get to that point, barring wild changes in voter affiliations or party coalitions, would require almost close to like... It would be unthinkable. It'd probably be bigger. I don't think there's ever been a popular vote win for Congress that has ever been that high. Because Congress, even in there's been presidential races that have had like 60-40 wins. But even in those, you don't see Congress seats like that. Congress vote like that because people are very willing to vote ticket split Congress seat and president race. So, I guess, just to say, the Republicans are probably relatively close to their ceiling here. Like, historically, they're relatively close, and it's... To go much higher would almost require sweeping most of the country. Like, pretty much every state would have to be red to go much higher. Like, yes, there's a couple districts you could point out here or there, like maybe some in New York, maybe some in California, that the Republicans could flip. Like, conceivably, right now. Maybe some in Michigan, etc., etc. You could probably point out some, but I think you're probably looking in the realm of one-hand number of seats. If you're talking about getting 10, 20, 30 more, that you pretty much, the Republicans have to sweep almost the entire country. Like every state here would almost be red to get that. And it's not really going to happen. Because, for example, Texas, right? If Texas went to the same vote share as, say, South Dakota here, you're still going to have Democrat seats in Texas because the most urban parts of Texas are wildly Democrat, like everywhere else. The biggest divide in the U.S. is by urbanicity. Generally speaking, you can approximate who's going to win an election with just one set of demographic numbers, and that is rural, suburban, urban. How those three groups are going to vote is one of the best tracks. Obviously, I use much more than that, but if you were to only use one number, that would be your best number to track it. Because generally speaking, the Republicans will always win the rurals, the Democrats will always win the urbans, and whoever wins the suburbs wins the race. So whoever's going to win the suburban ones are going to win the Congress. Whoever's going to win the suburban ones are going to win the presidency, etc., etc. So, and in that context, it's currently R plus 11 for suburbs. So, by my model. Which is... So, this seems to be the ceiling. Close to it for the Republicans, I think. Practically. But with that, I'll end this here. I got a bit rambly there at the end. If you thought that was too rambly, let me know below, and I will refrain from that in the future. If you liked the video, smash the like button, subscribe to the channel so you can stay up to date with all of the cool stuff I do, and share it with your friends. Spread the word. It will help me out quite a bit, and I will greatly appreciate it. Otherwise, I wish... have a good day, and I will see you hopefully Tuesday with an update on something, probably Canadian. Otherwise, have a wonderful day.